The chocolate cake sat perfectly centered on my grandmother's china plates, 38 candles waiting to be lit. I'd been awake since 4 in the morning, just like every year, preparing David's favorite German chocolate cake from scratch. The kitchen still smelled of coconut and pecans, mingling with the aroma of the prime rib roasting in the oven. At 64, I should have been tired of this ritual, but traditions die hard, especially when you're the only one maintaining them. I smoothed my navy dress, the one David had once said made me look decent enough for company, and checked my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman staring back had silver hair pulled into a practical bun, laugh lines that had deepened into permanent fixtures, and eyes that held decades of quiet determination. My hands, still steady despite the arthritis, bore the calluses of someone who'd never stopped working. The house gleamed around me, every surface polished to perfection. The dining room table was set with my best china, crystal glasses catching the afternoon light. Everything was exactly as David expected it to be, as it had been for 38 years. But today felt different. Maybe it was the weight of the documents I'd signed yesterday, now locked away in my bedroom safe. Or maybe it was the phone call I'd had with Emma that morning, my voice shaking as I told her what I decided to do.
Emma.
Even thinking her name brought a smile to my face. 28 years old, brilliant, kind, and the daughter I'd never given birth to, but had chosen to love anyway. She'd been 7 when I married her father, Robert, a widower struggling to raise a little girl who'd lost her mother too young. That had been 21 years ago, and Emma had been the light of my life ever since. Unlike my biological son, David. I heard his BMW pull into the driveway, the engine cutting off with the expensive purr that reminded me of everything I'd made possible for him. His footsteps on the front porch were heavy, deliberate, accompanied by the sharp click of his Italian leather shoes. "Mom, I'm here," he called, his voice carrying that familiar edge of impatience that had become his default tone over the years. David appeared in the kitchen doorway, loosening his silk tie with quick, irritated movements. At 38, he'd inherited his father's tall frame and dark hair, but where Marcus had been gentle despite his flaws, David was all sharp angles and cold ambition. He wore his success like armor, the expensive suit, the gold watch, the air of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said, forcing warmth into my voice. "I made your favorite cake." He glanced at the elaborate spread I'd prepared, his eyes cataloging everything with the detached assessment of someone taking inventory. The prime rib, the Duchess potatoes, the green beans almondine, the cake that had taken me 3 hours to decorate. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not gratitude, but calculation. "Thanks," he said, already moving toward the liquor cabinet. "I need a drink first. It's been a hell of a day." I watched him pour 3 fingers of the expensive bourbon I'd bought specifically for occasions like this. He never asked about my day, never wondered if I might have had challenges of my own. At 64, my days were filled with managing the architectural firm he believed he ran, overseeing investments he knew nothing about, and maintaining the lifestyle he'd grown accustomed to without ever questioning its source. "How's the firm?" I asked, though I'd reviewed the quarterly reports that morning while he was still sleeping. "Fine," he said curtly, settling into the chair at the head of the table, the seat that had been Robert's, then mine after his death, then somehow David's without discussion. "Though I don't know why you insist on staying involved. You don't understand the complexities of modern architecture." I served his plate, piling it high with food I'd spent hours preparing. "I suppose you're right. I'm just a simple woman who married an architect." He didn't catch the edge in my voice. David had always been remarkably deaf to subtlety when it didn't serve his interests. We ate in relative silence, broken only by his complaints about clients, contractors, and city planners. I made appropriate sounds of sympathy and concern, playing the role I'd perfected over the years. The devoted mother, the supportive presence, the woman who existed primarily to make his life easier. "I saw Emma last week," I mentioned casually, cutting my roast into small pieces. "She's doing incredible work at the nonprofit. They're expanding to 3 more cities." David's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Even now, 21 years later, Mentioning my stepdaughter could still trigger his resentment. "I'm sure she is," he said, his voice tight. "You always did think she could do no wrong. She's worked very hard for her success. Haven't we all?" He took a large gulp of wine. "Some of us just don't have the luxury of starting with built-in advantages." I set down my fork carefully. This was familiar territory, the subtle accusations, the implication that I'd somehow favored Emma over him. The irony wasn't lost on me. David had inherited more opportunities than most people could dream of, but he'd convinced himself he was perpetually disadvantaged. "You've had plenty of advantages, David." He laughed, but there was no humor in it.
Right.
Like having my mother remarry when I was 17 and suddenly having to share her attention with some stranger's kid. Robert was a good man. He was good to both of us. "He was good to you," David corrected. "He tolerated me because he had to. And then you practically adopted that girl, fawning over her like she was some kind of precious princess." I thought of 7-year-old Emma, lost and grieving, trying so hard to be good, to not be a burden. I thought of the nights I'd held her while she cried for her mama, the way she'd gradually learned to trust me, to let me love her. I thought of 17-year-old David's sullen resentment, his determination to make her feel unwelcome in what he considered his house. She was a grieving child, David. She needed care. And I didn't? I'd just lost my father 2 years earlier, and then suddenly I had to share my mother with strangers. The candles on his birthday cake flickered in my peripheral vision. 38 candles for 38 years of this. 38 years of walking on eggshells around his feelings, of managing his resentments, of trying to balance his needs against everyone else's. "You never lost me," I said quietly. "I was always there for you." David finished his wine and reached for the bottle. The alcohol was making him bolder, more willing to voice the grievances he usually kept simmering just below the surface. "Were you?" He looked at me with eyes that held decades of accumulated anger. "Because from where I sat, it looked like you were pretty busy playing mother to someone else's kid." The words hung in the air between us, sharp and cutting. I felt something inside me go very still, very quiet. This wasn't new. David had been perfecting these particular wounds for years. But tonight, on his birthday, surrounded by food I'd made and wine I'd paid for in a house I owned and furnished, something in me reached a breaking point. "I did my best," I said simply. "Your best." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with calculating eyes. "You want to know what I remember about your best? I remember you teaching her to ride a bike while I had to figure it out myself. I remember you helping her with scholarship applications while telling me to handle my own college prep. I remember you crying at her college graduation like she'd just won the Nobel Prize." Each accusation was a small knife, carefully aimed. The terrible thing was that some of them held grains of truth. I had helped Emma more than David in certain ways. But what he conveniently forgot was that by the time Emma came into our lives, David had already established his pattern of rejecting help, of pushing away support, of interpreting every gesture of love as either insufficient or suspect. "I helped you too," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest. "Did you?" David's laugh was bitter. "Name one thing, Mom. One meaningful thing you've done for me that actually mattered." The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could have listed 1,000 things. The sleepless nights when he was sick, the school events I never missed, the way I'd quietly arranged for him to have a position at the firm, the bills I'd paid, the problems I'd solved, the way I'd stepped back and let him believe he was running everything himself. But looking at his face, I realized the futility of it all. David had spent 38 years building a narrative in which he was the victim and I was the inadequate mother. No list of sacrifices would penetrate that armor. No accounting of love given would balance his books of resentment received. I smiled. It was a small smile, quiet and sad and final. "You're right," I said. "I've never done anything for you." The words seemed to surprise him. He'd been expecting an argument, a defensive recitation of my maternal resume. Instead, I'd given him exactly what he'd asked for, validation of his grievances. "Well," he said, suddenly looking uncertain. "I didn't mean." "No, David. You're absolutely right. I stood up, beginning to clear the dishes. I've never done anything meaningful for you. Never sacrificed or struggled or worried or worked on your behalf. You've managed everything all by yourself. I could see him trying to process this unexpected capitulation. He'd won the argument, but victory felt hollow when the opponent refused to fight. We finished dinner in silence. I served the cake, sang happy birthday in a voice that sounded strangely distant to my own ears, and watched him blow out his candles. He made a wish, probably for something he believed I'd never given him. After he left, I sat in the gathering darkness of my dining room, surrounded by the debris of celebration. The house felt different now, charged with the electricity of impending change. I thought about the documents upstairs, about the phone calls I would need to make, about the conversation I would have with Emma tomorrow morning. David wanted to know what I'd never done for him. By tomorrow night, he would have his answer. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in Robert's old leather chair, the one David had always coveted but never dared claim, and watched the hours crawl toward dawn. The house held its breath around me, as if sensing the earthquake that was about to reshape its foundation. At 5:30, I made coffee and called Emma. Margaret. Her voice was thick with sleep, but immediately alert. 21 years of being my daughter had taught her to recognize when something was wrong. What's happened? Can you come over this morning? We need to talk. Of course. Give me an hour. I spent that hour in my home office, a room David had never bothered to enter because he assumed it contained nothing more than recipe collections and charity correspondence. The irony would have been delicious if it weren't so tragic. Here, surrounded by financial statements and legal documents, I'd spent 15 years quietly building and managing the empire he thought he controlled. The architectural firm, Morrison and Associates, had been Robert's modest practice when we married. After his death, I'd transformed it into one of the most respected firms in the Southeast through careful expansion, strategic partnerships, and shrewd investments. David believed he'd accomplished this growth. He gave interviews to trade magazines about his vision, spoke at conferences as the firm's creative director, and basked in the respect of his peers. He had no idea that every major decision flowed through me, that his name on contracts was merely a formality, that the senior partners called me first when problems arose. David was the face of Morrison and Associates, but I was its heart, brain, and backbone. Emma arrived precisely 1 hour later, as she always did. She knocked twice and entered with her key, calling out as she came through the foyer. In the office, I replied. She appeared in the doorway carrying 2 cups of coffee from the shop near her apartment, her auburn hair pulled back in the messy bun she favored for weekend mornings. At 28, Emma had inherited her father's height and artistic eye, but her compassion was entirely her own creation. She wore jeans and a soft green sweater that made her look younger than her years, though her eyes held the quiet wisdom that had made her such an effective advocate for homeless youth. "You look terrible," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the blunt honesty that had always characterized our relationship. "I feel terrible." She studied my face with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read my moods before she'd learned to read books. David's birthday dinner didn't go well. It wasn't a question. Emma had weathered enough of David's storms to recognize the aftermath. He told me I've never done anything for him. Emma's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. He said what? I repeated David's words exactly, watching as her expression shifted from surprise to anger to something harder and more resolved. Emma had spent her childhood trying to win David's acceptance, her teenage years avoiding his cruelty, and her adulthood maintaining careful distance from his toxicity. She knew better than anyone how his mind worked. "And what did you say?" I agreed with him. This time she did set down her coffee cup. "Margaret." I told him he was right, that I'd never done anything meaningful for him. I opened the folder I'd prepared the night before. "And now I'm going to make sure that's true." Emma leaned forward, her non-profit instincts sharpening. "What are you planning?" I slid the documents across my desk. "I'm disappearing, sweetheart. And I'm taking everything with me." She picked up the papers, legal transfers, financial authorizations, property deeds. Her eyes widened as she processed the scope of what I was showing her. The firm, she breathed. The house, the investments. Everything David believes he owns. Everything he's taken credit for is going to you. Morrison and Associates will have a new CEO as of Monday morning. The house will be yours by next weekend. His trust fund, which he's never bothered to examine closely, will be frozen pending restructuring. Emma looked up from the documents, her face pale. Margaret, this is nuclear. Yes, it is. He'll be devastated. Destroyed. Good. The word came out harder than I'd intended, carrying decades of suppressed anger. Emma had heard me frustrated, disappointed, even hurt, but she'd never heard me sound ruthless. I need you to understand something, I continued. This isn't a momentary decision born from one hurtful comment. This is the culmination of 38 years of watching my son systematically diminish every gesture of love I've made toward him. He's convinced himself that I'm a failure as a mother, that I've never provided him with anything of value. So I'm going to give him the gift of being right. Emma set the papers down carefully. Where will you go? I've bought a house in Savannah. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. I'll transfer there quietly, set up a new life. I paused, studying her face. The question is whether you want to take on Morrison and Associates. It's a good firm, profitable, with excellent growth potential. But it also means dealing with David when he realizes what's happened. He'll fight this legally. He can try, but he has no legal standing. The firm has always been in my name. Robert left it to me, not to David. The house is mine. The investments are mine. David has been living in a fantasy where hard work and masculine authority entitled him to ownership. But legal reality is different. Emma was quiet for a long moment, processing not just the logistics but the emotional earthquake I was describing. Finally, she spoke. He's going to hate me even more than he already does. Probably. He'll blame you for this. He'll say you manipulated me, turned me against him. Let him. She picked up one of the documents, the transfer of company ownership. Margaret, are you sure about this? Once you do this, there's no going back. David will never forgive you. I thought about David's face the night before, the cold calculation in his eyes as he delivered his verdict on my maternal failures. I thought about the years I'd spent walking on eggshells, trying to balance his needs against everyone else's, accepting blame for his disappointments and credit for none of his successes. I don't want his forgiveness, I said. I want my freedom. Emma nodded slowly. When? I'm leaving tonight. I've already moved most of my personal belongings, did it gradually over the past month, so David wouldn't notice. The movers will come Monday for the rest. By the time David wakes up tomorrow morning, I'll be in Georgia, and you'll be the legal owner of Morrison and Associates. What about his position? That's up to you. You're the new CEO. If you want to keep him on as an employee, that's your decision. But he'll be working for you now, not the other way around. The delicious irony wasn't lost on either of us. David, who'd spent years resenting his little sister, would now be dependent on her goodwill for his livelihood. There's something else, I said, reaching for another folder. David's always believed he was entitled to an inheritance when I die. He's made comments over the years about the house being his someday, about carrying on the family business. I want him to understand exactly what he's lost. I opened the folder to reveal a detailed financial statement, the true scope of Morrison and Associates' worth, the property values, the investment portfolios, the life insurance policies. The numbers were staggering, even to Emma. My God, Margaret. You're worth more than David ever imagined. And now it's yours. Emma stared at the figures, her nonprofit mind automatically calculating what this meant. This changes everything. Yes, it does. You'll be able to expand your homeless advocacy work however you want. Buy that building you've been eyeing for the youth center. Travel, invest, live without financial constraints. I paused. Or you can give it all back to David and pretend this conversation never happened. She looked up sharply. Is that what you want? What I want is for you to have choices. Real choices. Not the careful compromises you've been making your whole life because you didn't want to seem greedy or demanding. I reached across the desk and took her hand. You've earned this, sweetheart. Not through birth or entitlement, but through being the daughter I chose. And who chose me back. Tears had started in Emma's eyes, but she blinked them away with characteristic determination. What about David's wife? His children? David had married Kelly 2 years ago, a woman as ambitious and calculating as he was, who'd produced one child and treated little Michael more like a status symbol than a person. 3-year-old Michael was a sweet, bright boy who barely knew me because his parents considered my presence an inconvenience. Kelly has her own career and family money. She'll be fine. As for Michael, I hesitated. I've set up an education fund for him that she can't touch. Whatever happens between David and me, Michael shouldn't suffer for it. Emma squeezed my hand. You really have thought of everything. I've had time to plan. We spent the next 2 hours going through details, bank account transfers, legal authorizations, contact information for key employees and clients. Emma took notes with the methodical precision that had made her such an effective nonprofit director. But I could see the emotional weight settling on her shoulders. There's one more thing, I said as we finished. I need you to promise me something. Anything. Don't let guilt make you soft with him. David is going to paint himself as the victim in this story. He's going to claim I've abandoned him, that you've stolen his birthright, that he's been betrayed by the 2 women who should have loved him most. I met her eyes. But remember what he said to me last night. Remember all the years he made you feel unwelcome in your own home. Remember that he chose this path. Emma nodded. I'll remember. And remember that you deserve everything I'm giving you. Not because you're perfect, but because you've loved me without conditions, supported me without reservation, and never once made me feel like my care was inadequate or unwanted. As the sun set that evening, I loaded the last of my belongings into my car. The house felt hollow, stripped of the personal touches that had made it mine. Tomorrow, David would wake up to find me gone, and his entire world restructured. By Monday, he would learn that the business he thought he controlled, the security he'd taken for granted, and the inheritance he'd assumed were all in someone else's hands. I thought about the letter I'd left on his kitchen counter, explaining exactly what he'd lost and why. But more than that, I thought about the road ahead, about the house in Savannah waiting for me, about the possibility of building a life based on my own choices rather than other people's needs. For the first time in 38 years, I was free. David woke up Saturday morning with a slight headache and a sense of satisfaction. The birthday dinner had gone exactly as expected, his mother fussing over him, serving his favorite foods, accepting his criticisms with that martyred patience she'd perfected over the years. Even better, he'd finally said what needed to be said. The truth about her failures as a mother, her misplaced priorities, her obvious preference for that stepdaughter who'd never belonged in their family to begin with. He rolled out of bed at 10 o'clock, later than usual, but justified by the previous night's celebration. Kelly had already left for her yoga class, taking Michael to her mother's afterward. The house was blissfully quiet. David shuffled to the kitchen in his robe, expecting to find coffee already made. His mother usually stopped by Saturday mornings to tidy up and prepare breakfast, but the coffee pot was cold, the counters bare. He checked his phone for messages. Nothing. Typical, he thought with familiar irritation. One honest conversation and she's sulking. He'd give her a few days to get over it. Then things would return to normal. They always did. He made his own coffee and toast, grumbling about having to fend for himself. By noon, his headache had faded enough for him to consider driving to the office. Morrison and Associates ran itself on weekends, but he liked to check in, to maintain the visible leadership presence that had earned him respect in the industry. David dressed carefully in one of his expensive suits, Italian wool, perfectly tailored, the uniform of a successful architect. He'd worked hard to build his reputation, to transform his stepfather's modest practice into a regional powerhouse. The architecture magazines that featured him regularly praised his innovative designs, his sustainable building practices, his ability to balance artistry with commercial viability. The drive to Morrison and Associates took 15 minutes through the historic district of Charlotte. David had always loved this route, loved seeing the buildings he'd designed dotting the skyline. Morrison and Associates employed over 50 people, and they all looked to him for creative direction. But when he pulled into his reserved parking space, something felt wrong. The lot was nearly empty, normal for a Saturday, but there were two cars he didn't recognize clustered near the main entrance. One was a black sedan with legal plates. David's satisfaction curdled into unease as he used his keycard to enter the building. Voices echoed from the direction of his office, his corner suite with its view of the city skyline. He recognized one voice, Patricia Wells, the firm's longtime office manager. The others were unfamiliar. "Patricia," David called out as he approached his office. "What's going on?" The conversation stopped abruptly. Patricia emerged from the office looking pale and uncomfortable, followed by two people David didn't know, a woman in a severe black suit carrying a briefcase, and a man with the generic appearance of a government bureaucrat. "David," Patricia said, her voice strained. "We need to talk." "About what? Who are these people?" The woman stepped forward, extending her hand with professional courtesy. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Sarah Chen from the legal firm of Chen and Associates. This is Thomas Wright from the Department of Revenue. We're here regarding the ownership transfer of Morrison and Associates." David stared at her. "Ownership transfer? What are you talking about?" Patricia cleared her throat. "David, your mother has transferred all company assets to Emma Pierce. Effective immediately. Ms. Pierce is now the majority owner and CEO of Morrison and Associates." The words hit David like physical blows. "That's impossible. This is my company. I run this company." "You've been an employee of this company," Sarah Chen corrected gently. "The business has always been owned by Margaret Morrison, your mother. She inherited it from her late husband, Robert Morrison, and has maintained sole ownership throughout its operation." David felt the floor shifting beneath him. "No, that's not. I built this company. I made it what it is." "According to our records," Thomas Wright interjected, consulting his tablet, "you've held the position of creative director since 2019, with an annual salary of $125,000 plus benefits. While you've certainly contributed to the company's success, you've never held an ownership stake." "This is insane," David said, his voice rising. "Where's my mother? I need to talk to my mother." Patricia and the lawyers exchanged glances. "She's not available," Patricia said carefully. "But she left this for you." She handed David an envelope, thick cream paper with his name written in his mother's careful script. David's hands shook as he tore it open. "David, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. You told me I've never done anything for you, and I realized you were absolutely right. So I've decided to stop trying. Morrison and Associates was never yours. It was Robert's, then mine, and now it belongs to Emma. You've been an employee, not an owner, though I let you believe otherwise because it seemed to make you happy. The house you think you'll inherit someday? It's Emma's now, too, along with the investments, the properties, and everything else you've taken for granted. You wanted to know what I've never done for you? I've never taught you gratitude. I've never shown you consequences. I've never made you understand that love is not a one-way transaction. Now you'll have the chance to build a life based on your own merits, without relying on things you never owned and accomplishments that were never yours. Emma will decide whether to keep you on as an employee. I suggest you treat her with more respect than you've ever shown me. You said I've never done anything for you. Now that's finally true. Margaret." David read the letter twice, 3 times, his mind struggling to process the implications. Around him, the lawyers and Patricia waited in uncomfortable silence. "This can't be legal," he finally said. "She can't just take everything. I'm her son." "I'm afraid she can," Sarah Chen replied. "Mrs. Morrison has been the sole legal owner of all assets. The transfers have been properly executed and filed. Ms. Pierce is now your employer, assuming she chooses to retain your services." David's phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "David, I know this is difficult, but we need to meet Monday at 9 a.m. to discuss your future with the company. Please don't be late. Emma Pierce, CEO Morrison and Associates." The casual authority in that message, the way she'd signed it with her new title, hit him like a slap. Emma, The interloper, the usurper, the little girl who'd never belonged, was now his boss. "I need to sit down," David said, stumbling toward his office chair. "Actually," Patricia said quietly, "this isn't your office anymore. Ms. Pierce asked that you clear out your personal belongings today. Security will supervise." David looked around the space he'd considered his domain for the past 5 years. The custom drafting table, the leather chairs, the framed awards for architectural excellence. None of it belonged to him anymore. "Where am I supposed to work?" "That's up to Miss Pierce," Sarachan said. "She'll discuss your employment status on Monday." The next hour passed in a humiliating blur. A security guard watched as David packed his personal items into boxes, family photos, a few books, the compass set Emma had given him for Christmas years ago. Everything else, the computer, the files, the professional awards displayed on his shelves, belonged to the company. Belonged to Emma. As he carried his boxes to his car, David tried calling his mother. The number went straight to voicemail, and her mailbox was full. He tried the house phone, disconnected. He drove to her house and found it empty, a sold sign planted in the front yard. She was really gone. David sat in his car outside the house where he'd lived after his father's death, staring at windows that no longer lit up for him. The magnitude of his loss was beginning to sink in. Not just the company or the money, but the entire foundation of his identity. He'd spent years introducing himself as the creative director of Morrison and Associates, networking based on that reputation, building relationships on the assumption of continued success and financial security. His phone rang. "Kelly." "How did the office visit go?" she asked. "Did you sign those new contracts?" David closed his eyes. How could he explain this? How could he tell his wife that everything they'd built their life around was gone? That the inheritance they'd counted on, the security they'd taken for granted, had vanished in a single morning? "David? Are you there?" "I'm here," he said. "We need to talk when you get home." "About what?" "You sound strange." "Just come home, Kelly. Come home, and we'll talk." He hung up and drove to his own house, a modest townhome that felt suddenly small and shabby compared to the mansion he'd expected to inherit. As he pulled into the driveway, he noticed things he'd never paid attention to before: the mortgage payment book on Kelly's desk, the stack of bills she managed, the careful way she budgeted their expenses. His salary at Morrison and Associates had been generous, but it wasn't enough to support the lifestyle they'd grown accustomed to. They'd been living on the assumption of future wealth, making purchases and taking vacations based on David's assurance that money would never be a problem. Now it was the only problem that mattered. David poured himself a drink and sat in his living room, surrounded by furniture they couldn't afford and photos of vacations they shouldn't have taken. In a few hours, Kelly would come home with Michael, expecting to find her successful husband relaxing after another profitable day at his company. Instead, she'd find a man who'd just discovered that his entire life had been built on foundations that belonged to someone else. The letter from his mother lay on the coffee table beside him, its words echoing in his mind. "You said I've never done anything for you." Now that's finally true. For the first time in his adult life, David Morrison had to face the terrifying possibility that he might have to succeed or fail entirely on his own merit. The thought was more frightening than he'd ever imagined. Kelly arrived home at 3:30 with Michael in tow, his voice bright with toddler excitement. David heard him chattering about the playground while Kelly laughed at something he'd said. Normal sounds of a normal Saturday afternoon in a life that was no longer normal. "Daddy." Michael burst through the front door first, his curls bouncing as he ran toward him. At 3, he was all energy and affection, too young to understand the storm that was about to reshape their family. David caught him in his arms, breathing in the sweet scent of his hair, trying to memorize this moment before everything changed. "You're home early," Kelly said, setting down her purse and studying David's face. Even after 2 years of marriage, she could read his moods with uncomfortable accuracy. "What's wrong?" "Michael, why don't you go play with your blocks for a while?" David suggested, forcing lightness into his voice. "Mommy and Daddy need to talk." Kelly's expression sharpened. She'd learned to recognize the tone that preceded difficult conversations. After Michael disappeared into the playroom, She settled into the chair across from David with the deliberate composure she'd cultivated since childhood. Kelly came from a middle-class family that had taught her to handle crises with practical determination. Her marketing career had provided stability to their household, and her social connections had opened doors throughout their marriage. She was beautiful in an understated way, with blonde hair she kept in a practical bob and a wardrobe chosen for maximum professional impact. "Well," she said. David had spent the past hour trying to find the right words, some way to explain the inexplicable. But sitting across from his wife, seeing her expectant expression, he realized there was no gentle way to deliver this news. "My mother has taken everything," he said simply. Kelly blinked. "What do you mean, taken everything?" "The company, the house, all of it. She's transferred everything to Emma and disappeared." For a moment, Kelly said nothing. Then she laughed, a short, sharp sound without humor. "That's impossible. Your mother doesn't have the authority to." "She does. It was all hers. I never actually owned any of it." David watched his wife process this information, saw the exact moment when the implications hit her. Kelly's face went through a series of calculations, financial, social, practical, before settling into the hard mask she wore when dealing with unpleasant realities. "Explain," she said. So David told her everything. The scene at the office, the lawyers, the humiliating discovery that he'd been an employee masquerading as an owner. He showed her Margaret's letter, watched her read it twice with the same shocked disbelief he'd experienced. "She can't do this," Kelly said finally. "There has to be something we can do. Challenge it legally. Prove undue influence. Something." The lawyers said it's all legal. She owned everything outright. Kelly stood up and began pacing, her mind racing through possibilities. "What about your salary? Your position? Emma will decide Monday whether to keep me on as an employee." The words tasted bitter. David had spent years dismissing Emma as an idealistic do-gooder, treating her with barely concealed contempt whenever their paths crossed. Now she held his professional future in her hands. "This is about the stepdaughter," Kelly said. "She's been working on your mother, turning her against you. This reeks of manipulation." David wanted to agree, to blame Emma for orchestrating his downfall. But Margaret's letter had been too specific, too detailed in its accusations. This wasn't manipulation. This was years of accumulated resentment finally finding expression. "I don't think so," he said quietly. "I think this is just Mom." Kelly stopped pacing. "Just Mom? David, your mother was a housewife who remarried well. She doesn't have the sophistication to orchestrate something like this." "Apparently, she does." The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications neither wanted to voice. Finally, Kelly sat down again, her posture rigid with contained panic. "What does this mean for us financially?" David had been dreading this question. "Your salary will cover the mortgage and basic expenses. My salary, if I still have one, should be enough for everything else." "Your salary?" Kelly's voice was very quiet. "David, we've been living well above your salary for 2 years. The new car, the preschool tuition, this house. We bought all of it assuming your inheritance would cover the shortfall." "I know. We're in debt. Serious debt." David nodded miserably. They'd leveraged their future against his expectations, making purchases and commitments based on wealth that had never actually been his. "What about Michael's college fund?" Kelly asked. "That was tied to the company profit sharing I thought I had." Kelly stood up again, this time moving to the window that overlooked their small backyard. Michael was building something elaborate with his blocks, his laughter carrying through the glass. "We'll have to sell the house," she said. "Probably move somewhere smaller. Take Michael out of Little Scholars." "Yes. Cancel the trip to Europe we planned for next summer." David nodded, though she couldn't see him. Each item on Kelly's list was another piece of their life being stripped away, another assumption that had crumbled along with everything else. "I should call my father," Kelly said. "See if he knows any employment lawyers." "To do what?" "To explore our options. Wrongful termination, breach of contract, something." She turned from the window, her expression hardening into the determined mask David recognized from her marketing campaigns. I'm not going to let some bitter old woman destroy our family because she had a tantrum. David flinched at her characterization of his mother, even though he'd said worse things himself over the years. Hearing it from Kelly's lips made the cruelty more obvious somehow. She's not bitter. She's angry. There's a difference. Angry about what? You've been a good son. You've worked hard, built the company up. I haven't built anything, David interrupted. That's the point. She built it. I just showed up and took credit. Kelly stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. That's ridiculous. You've worked 60-hour weeks for years. You've made that company what it is. Have I? Or have I just been following plans she made, implementing strategies she developed, taking credit for successes she orchestrated? David rubbed his face tiredly. Reading that letter, thinking about everything that's happened, I'm not sure I've ever actually accomplished anything on my own. Stop it. Kelly's voice was sharp. Don't you dare have a crisis of confidence now. We need to fight this, not fall apart. But David was already falling apart. The revelation that his entire professional identity had been a fiction was cascading through his sense of self, unraveling everything he'd believed about his capabilities and accomplishments. His phone buzzed with a text message from Emma. David, I know this is difficult, but I want you to know that despite everything, I value your contributions to the company. We'll talk Monday about how to move forward. Try to have a good weekend with your family. The message was professional but not unkind. It was more consideration than David had ever shown Emma during the years they'd known each other. What does she want? Kelly asked, reading over his shoulder. To talk Monday about my future. At least she's keeping you on. Maybe. Or maybe she's just being polite before she fires me. Kelly sank back into her chair, the fight temporarily draining out of her. How did this happen, David? How did we not see this coming? David thought about his mother's birthday dinner, about the careful way she'd serve his favorite foods and listen to his complaints, about the quiet smile she'd given him when he delivered his final devastating judgment. She tried to tell me, he said quietly. Not directly, but she tried to show me. All those years, she kept managing things behind the scenes, kept solving problems I didn't even know existed. And I kept dismissing her, kept acting like she was just in the way. She was your mother. It was her job to support you. Was it her job to support me while I treated her stepdaughter like garbage? Was it her job to fund my lifestyle while I complained about everything she'd done wrong? David looked at his wife, seeing for the first time how much she resembled him in her sense of entitlement. Maybe she got tired of having a job where the only payment was criticism. Kelly's expression hardened. I can't believe you're taking her side. I'm not taking anyone's side. I'm just trying to understand how we got here. The back door opened, and Michael tumbled inside, blocks scattered in his wake. Daddy, come see what I built. It's a castle for the dragons. David looked at his son, bright, eager, innocent of the catastrophe reshaping their world. In a few days, they'd have to start explaining why things were changing, why Daddy's job was different, why they couldn't afford the things they'd taken for granted. Just a minute, buddy, David said. Let me finish talking to Mommy. But as Michael ran back outside, David realized there was nothing left to discuss. The damage was done, the consequences set in motion. All that remained was figuring out how to build a life from the wreckage of their assumptions. And somehow, Monday morning, he would have to sit across from Emma Pierce and ask her for the mercy he'd never shown her. The irony wasn't lost on him. For the first time in his life, David would have to rely on the kindness of the woman he'd spent 21 years trying to make feel unwelcome in her own home. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, matching David's mood as he drove to Morrison & Associates for what might be his final day as an employee. He'd spent the weekend in a haze of financial calculations and difficult conversations, each one reinforcing the magnitude of his fall from grace. The parking lot felt different now that he knew he was just another worker reporting to someone else's company. His old reserved space near the entrance bore a new nameplate, E. Pierce, CEO. David parked in the general employee section, walking past the landscaping he'd never paid attention to when he thought he owned it. Inside, The Monday morning bustle continued as usual. Employees nodded to him with the same deference they'd always shown, unaware that the hierarchy had shifted beneath their feet. David wondered how long it would take for word to spread, how the revelation of his true status would change these interactions. He rode the elevator to the executive floor, his stomach churning with anxiety and wounded pride. The hallway that had once felt like his domain now seemed foreign, hostile. Outside what had been his office, he paused. Through the glass walls, he could see Emma seated behind the mahogany desk, reviewing documents with the focused intensity he remembered from her teenage years. She'd changed nothing about the office except for a single framed photograph on the desk, a picture of herself with Margaret from last Christmas, both women smiling with genuine warmth. The sight of his mother's face, relaxed and happy in a way David couldn't remember seeing in years, hit him like a physical blow. "Come in," Emma called without looking up. David knocked and waited for permission to enter his former sanctuary. "Sit down, David," Emma said, finally meeting his eyes. At 28, she commanded the space with natural authority. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and she wore a navy suit that conveyed both competence and power. But her eyes, those were still the eyes of the 7-year-old girl who'd tried so hard to earn his acceptance. "How was your weekend?" she asked. The question seemed genuinely curious rather than mocking. David searched her expression for signs of gloating, for the satisfaction of victory, but found only professional courtesy tinged with something that might have been compassion. "Difficult," he admitted. "I imagine it was." She set down her pen and folded her hands. "David, I want you to understand that I didn't ask for this. Margaret made this decision entirely on her own. But you accepted it." "Yes, I did. Because she asked me to, and because I believe she had the right to dispose of her property as she saw fit." Emma's voice remained calm, measured. "But that doesn't mean I want to see you destroyed." David almost laughed at the irony. "Destroyed? I think we're already past that point." "Are we?" "That depends largely on the choices you make from here forward." Emma opened a folder and slid a document across the desk. David recognized it as an employment contract, his employment contract, with several significant modifications. "I'm offering you a position as senior architect," she said. "It's a step down from what you've been doing, but it's still a leadership role with real responsibilities. The salary is $85,000 annually, plus performance bonuses if your projects meet their targets." David stared at the numbers. It was roughly 2/3 of what he'd been making, but more than he'd expected given the circumstances. "Why?" "Because despite everything, you do understand architecture. You have genuine talent, real creative vision. I'd be foolish to throw away that ability out of spite." "But you could fire me." "I mean, after everything David stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "After everything you what? Treated me badly when we were kids? Made me feel unwelcome in my own home? Acted like I was stealing something that belonged to you?" Emma's voice remained level, but David heard the steel beneath it. "Yes, you could have been kinder. But holding grudges is exhausting, and I have a company to run." David read through the contract terms, noting the performance requirements and behavioral expectations. It was generous under the circumstances, but it also made clear that he would be working for her, following her directives, answerable to her authority. "There are conditions," Emma continued. "First, you report directly to me. No undermining, no going around my decisions, no attempts to rally other employees to your cause. Second, you treat everyone in this company with respect, from the executives to the construction crew. And third, if you have any contact with Margaret, you will treat her with dignity." "She's gone," David said quietly. "I don't even know where she is." "She's in Savannah. She bought a house near the historic district, and she's very happy." Emma's expression softened slightly. "She's not hiding, David. She just doesn't want to hear from you right now." "Did she say that?" "She said she needs time to heal from 38 years of feeling unappreciated, and that if you ever want a relationship with her again, you'll need to figure out how to become the son she always hoped you could be." The words hit David like stones, each one precisely aimed at the guilt and self-doubt he'd been carrying since Saturday. He thought about his mother alone in a strange city, starting over at 64 because her own son had made her feel unwanted in the life she'd built. What about my son, Michael? Will he ever see her again? For the first time, Emma's composure cracked slightly. Margaret loves that little boy, but she won't use him as a weapon against you, and she won't put him in the middle of this conflict. If you want him to have a relationship with his grandmother, you'll need to find a way to make that possible. David signed the contract without reading it again. What choice did he have? But as he wrote his name, he realized something had shifted in his thinking. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about facing the truth of who he'd been and who he might still become. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. Emma nodded. "Your office is on the 3rd floor. Patricia will show you around and introduce you to the staff you'll be working with." As David stood to leave, Emma called after him. "David, for what it's worth, I think Margaret still loves you. But love isn't enough anymore. She needs to see change, real change, before she'll let you back into her life." That evening, David sat in his soon-to-be former dining room, helping Michael with a puzzle, while Kelly made phone calls to real estate agents and preschools, beginning the practical work of downsizing their lives. "Daddy," Michael said, looking up from the colorful pieces scattered across the table. "Why haven't we seen Grandma Margaret lately?" David's hand paused over the puzzle piece he'd been about to place. "Grandma Margaret moved away, buddy. She lives in a different state now." "Is she mad at us?" The innocence of the question broke David's heart.
"No, sweetheart."
"She's not mad at you. She loves you very much. Then why did she leave without saying goodbye?" David looked at his son's earnest face, so trusting and confused. How could he explain that Grandma Margaret had left because Daddy had spent years being cruel and ungrateful? How could he make a 3-year-old understand that some hurts ran too deep for simple apologies? "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," David said carefully. "And sometimes those mistakes hurt people we love. Grandma Margaret needed some space to feel better. Will she come back?" "I don't know, Michael. Maybe someday." Michael returned to his puzzle, but David could see the wheels turning in his young mind. "I miss Grandma Margaret. She made the best pancakes." "I miss her too," David said, and realized it was true. That night, after Michael was asleep, David sat alone in his study and opened his laptop. He typed Margaret Morrison, Savannah, Georgia into the search engine, but stopped before hitting enter. What was he looking for? Her address, so he could show up and demand forgiveness? Her phone number so he could call and argue about fairness? Instead, he opened a new document and began to write. "Dear Mom, I know you don't want to hear from me right now, and I understand why. I know you said I've never done anything for you, and I'm starting to realize how true that was. I spent 38 years taking everything you gave me and finding reasons why it wasn't enough. I made you feel unwelcome in your own life because I was angry about things that weren't your fault. I treated Emma badly because I was jealous of the love you showed her, never understanding that love isn't diminished by sharing it. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. But I want you to know that I'm finally seeing clearly, and I don't like what I see. Emma offered me a job today. She didn't have to do that. She could have fired me, could have made me pay for every cruel thing I said to her when we were kids. Instead, she gave me a chance to prove I can be better. I'm going to take that chance, Mom. Not because I expect you to care, but because I finally understand that being your son meant something, and I wasted it. Michael asks about you. He misses your pancakes. He loves you without conditions, the way I should have, but never learned how. If you ever want to see him again, I promise I won't stand in the way. He deserves to know the grandmother who loved him before he could disappoint her. I hope Savannah is beautiful. I hope you're happy. I hope someday you'll be proud to call me your son. Love, David." He read the letter 3 times, then saved it to his drafts folder. Tomorrow he would have to learn how to be Emma's employee, how to rebuild his career from a position of humility rather than entitlement. He would have to help Kelly navigate their financial crisis, figure out how to provide for his family on a fraction of their former income. But tonight, He would sit with the weight of his mother's absence and try to understand what he'd lost when he'd pushed away the one person who'd loved him unconditionally. In Savannah, Margaret Morrison stood on the porch of her new house, breathing in the scent of jasmine and watching fireflies dance in the warm evening air. For the first time in decades, she felt truly free. Free from the weight of other people's expectations, free from the burden of loving someone who couldn't love her back. She thought about David sometimes, wondered if he was learning to stand on his own feet, if he was finally understanding the value of what he'd taken for granted. But mostly she thought about the future, about the garden she would plant, the books she would read, the life she would build on her own terms. At 64, Margaret had learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is walking away. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to stop trying to save someone else. The historic district of Savannah stretched out before her, full of possibilities and new beginnings. It was enough. Finally, it was enough.